welcome to the online MOOC course on software engineering. Today we will look into risk management. Risk management has three main phases: identification, assessment and mitigation. So the agenda of today starts with foundation, how risks are going to be identified, how it is going to be assessed and how we can mitigate the risk, followed by monitoring and how we are going to use that in software engineering. We will start with the foundations. Mainly this risk is going to be a process which needs to be done in all the phases of software engineering. We have to identify what the risk is, assess the risk, and if there is any risk we have to make sure it gets mitigated and follow some procedures in order to overcome that corresponding risk. Risks are majorly classified as proactive risk and reactive risk. Reactive risk strategy means that we will try to identify the risk only after the risk happens, which is we call as reactive risk strategy. Whereas in proactive risk strategy, the risk will be monitored, and even before the risk arises we try to do some set of procedure, and that we call it as proactive risk strategy. And we can understand that being proactive is much more better than the reactive strategy. Why? Because we will be trying to identify the risk at the early stage itself, and much problems may not arise at the later point of time. So, we will understand what actually is risk with respect to identifying reactively. Okay. So, as we have understood, this risk being addressed once they arise, it is called as reactive risk strategy. So, it is like after the problem has arisen, we identify it and then follow what are the procedures that could be taken care in order to avoid the risk, and then we will carry out the steps. So, only after the risk gets into the project we will identify it, and then we will try to identify how we are going to overcome that risk and take the procedures. So, obviously it will take a longer time to overcome that corresponding risk. So, this is less effective when compared to the other strategy that we are going to see. Okay. But it is trying to address the problems only after they occur. The second strategy is called as proactive. So, which means that even before the risk comes into the software development stage, we will try to use this. So, we will have something called as a planning and mitigation process. So, mitigation is going to be the process that we will be using to overcome the risk. So, the steps that we need to address when there is a risk is identified much earlier before the risk comes into the project. Okay. So, before they impacts the project, we will have a certain set of steps that could be used in order to overcome the risk. So, the time taken to make the contingency plan is very minimal when compared to the reactive risk strategy. So, it is also going to reduce the likelihood of project failure. Importance of proactive approach. So, here the proactive approach is going to produce better control over the project outcomes, such that the risks are all managed systematically and thereby reducing the overall project uncertainty. So, risk is going to have a life cycle which is going to have 4 phases. The first phase is identification, second stage is assessment, third stage is going to be mitigation, and fourth stage is monitoring. So, we will go from one stage to the next. So, first one is going to be the identification phase, where we will try to identify what are the risks that are potentially that could arise throughout the software development life cycle. So, how we can identify whether the risk may come or not? So that would be a question. So the answer is we can have something called as brainstorming, SWOT analysis, checklist, prior risk strategies that has been used in the organization. So using these approaches, we can identify whether risks are available or is there is a probability of having risk at the later point of time. The second stage going to be the assessment, where we will be having certain risk that has been identified from the previous stage. So with that list of risk, we will identify whether how much probable that risk is going to happen, whether it is less probable or more probable. So less probable in the sense that risk may happen, but will be in little numbers. But if it is more probable, it is likely to happen at any point of time. The second thing with respect to assessment is the impact. So even though if it has a higher probability or lesser probability of occurrence, the impact is going to be the major thing. So impact is what it is going to, what kind of risk is going to happen. Whether it is monetary risk or a performance risk or any casual risk, what kind of risk and how it is going to impact the software development. So that is going to be the assessment, and based on the probability and impact, we will try to prioritize the risk and we will try to handle them one by one. So prioritizing is also very important, because if we have say n risk, so from risk 1, 2, 3 up to n, and we have the probability and the impact. Okay. So consider that the risk 1 is going to have very high probability, okay, and risk 3 is going to have low probability, okay, and risk say 7 is going to have high probability, okay, and we will assume the other risk have some amount of probabilities. If risk 1 is having very catastrophical impact, okay, and risk 7 is going to have negligible impact, okay. So in this case, when it comes to prioritization, the risk 1 will be having very high priority when compared to risk 7. Why? Because the probability is also high and the impact is going to create some catastrophical problems. So when compared to high and catastrophical, high and negligible is going to have less priority. So that comes under your risk assessment. So mainly we will identify what is going to be the probability, what is going to be the impact, we will calculate the risk assessment and prioritize them for which order we have to proceed for. The third step is going to be the mitigation. This is a very important step. So once you have identified and you have assessed the risk, next we are going for mitigation. So mitigation is going to be the procedure that you will do in order to reduce the impact of the risk. So risk has already happened, and once the risk has happened, a certain set of procedures has to be taken in order to reduce the impact and proceed further. Okay. So this includes avoidance, transfer, mitigation and acceptance. So avoidance is going to be the process if you are trying to mitigate prior to the occurrence of risk. So you are trying to avoid that risk by taking care a particular set of steps. Transfer is you are going to change this risk to another risk, okay, which is manageable probably, and mitigation is you have taken that risk and you have actually gone through a certain set of procedures in order to overcome that risk. Fourth stage is acceptance. There is no other way, we have to live in with that corresponding risk and you have to go forward. The fourth stage, it is going to be a continuous monitoring stage. So if you have done risk assessment, risk management altogether, it is not going to be a single step or it is not going to be one single phase. Risk management is going to be throughout the software development life cycle. So, the continuous monitoring is going to make sure that the risk is managed throughout the project life cycle. Okay. So, this is managed throughout the project life cycle. So, what it has, it is trying to track the risk, identify new risk as and when, and evaluating the effectiveness of mitigation strategies. So, risk cannot be avoided 100%. So, some set of risk will be there in software development. So, if you have identified some risk, you will be trying to track what is the stage in that corresponding instance, and whether any new risk has come into the picture and what are going to be their mitigation strategies. So, this will be done throughout the project life cycle, the software development phase. So, this is going to be the 4 stages of risk management. It is going to be identification, assessment, mitigation and monitoring. So, we will go through each and every phase in detail. So, first step is identification. So, as we have discussed, we will have various methods. One of them is brainstorming. So, brainstorming is going to be a formal meeting wherein you will communicate with the stakeholders. So, who are the stakeholders? Stakeholders are any person who has interest towards your project. So, mainly your customer, client, other competitors, everyone can be your stakeholders. So, there will be a brainstorming session to identify what could be the potential risk within the software development. So, this approach will try to identify various perspectives of different kind of people. So, stakeholders, as I said, you can have clients, you can have customers who are going to use that corresponding project, and other developers and competitors, as I said, if they are okay. So, when you have multiple perspectives from each and every stakeholders, you might have got a set of risks, that is going to associate with your project. So, this is one basic method with which you can identify the risk associated with the software development. Second is SWOT analysis. So, SWOT stands for strength, weakness, opportunities and threat. So, based on the project, there will be a analysis with which we can identify what are all the threats with respect to the project. So, both internal and external risk will be considered, and this is also going to produce a comprehensive view of the project environment. So, through these methods, various risk items are being taken for consideration. So, that includes, one is product size. So, the size of the project that has to be built. So, that is one of the risks to be associated. Second is the business impact. So, how it is going to work in the market. So, that is the business impact. Second is customer characteristics. So, how sophisticated the customer is going to be in using the project. So, you have built a particular software and it has to be in a position usable to the customer. So, there should be some amount of knowledge that is required from the customer side also, that is also considered as risk. The next one is process definition. So, in the prior classes you might have learned software process. So, we have waterfall model, spiral model, iterative development model, agile process, various kinds of process, and for a particular specification, some set of process are only feasible. So, by using different process within the software development will also create risk. So, that is considered in this point. And the development environment. So, there are several set of tools that are available, and usage of those tools may create some risk in the development environment. So, that it is not only tools, the hardware, the quality of the tools, the availability of the tools, everything come together with respect to this development environment. The next point is the technology. So, sometimes it is when the bus technology comes into picture, people tend to use the technology in order to make the product more visible in the environment, in the business world. So, using some new technology should not be something that is not necessary. Okay. So, that is the risk with respect to technology that has been associated with respect to newness. The staff size and experience. So, the most of the human resource will have the risk associated with respect to the technical capability and the working nature. So, these are going to be the risk items that we have to consider in order to identify the risk through the various techniques like brainstorming, SWOT analysis, interviews and other stuffs. The second one is risk assessment, where we will go with respect to the risk probability identification and impact assessment. So, the probability, as I said, it is going to be the likelihood of occurrence. So, how much frequently the risk is going to happen in the software life cycle. So, this is ranging from negligible to high. So, negligible in the sense the likelihood of occurrence is very less or sometimes 0, and it moves to high, which means that it will occur for sure. So, this probability scale is trying to help us in prioritizing the risk with respect to which has to be considered first or second or at the last. Second is the impact severity or impact basically. So, even though we have the project probability, meaning the risk probability, how much it is going to impact is very important. So, it ranges from minor to catastrophic. So, to be specific, we have 4 main impacts that is considered overall. So, one is negligible, second is marginal, third is critical, and fourth is catastrophic. Okay. So, the impact could be ranging from negligible, marginal, critical to catastrophic, where the impacts goes high at the end. So, negligible is very less impact, followed by marginal, followed by critical and catastrophic. So, this is going to help us in determining what is going to be the consequences, okay, when the risk arises or materializes in the software development life cycle. Risk exposure. So, risk exposure is actually RE is going to be with respect to the probability and the impact. Okay. So, probability and impact we have learnt in the prior slides, and it is calculated by multiplying the probability and the impact. So, basically RE is going to help you in prioritizing the risk, and from that priority we will try to allocate the resource effectively such that we can mitigate at the most significant threats. Next is building the risk table. So, once you have identified the risk and you have assessed, for assessment we have to build this risk table. So, the risk table normally include the risk description, what it is going to be, the category it belongs to, the probability, impact and the exposure. Okay. So, risk will have a risk number, a description, what category it belongs to, what is going to be the probability, which means the likelihood of impact, likelihood of occurrence, impact, how much it is going to affect the project, and the risk exposure. So, based on these contents we are trying to identify the risk prioritization. We will go forward the risk prioritization. So, the sorting and prioritization will be taken by ranking the set of risks. So, this is going to be the risk assessment chart. So, on the top you will be having the probability scale, and on the left we have the severity scale. So, as I said, it starts from negligible, marginal, critical and catastrophical, and on the probability side it is frequent to unlikely. So, unlikely in the sense the probability is very less, and when it goes on the left the probability is very high. Okay. So, when you consider a table like this, those risk comes under this point. Okay. So, this is going to have a very high probability than a negligible severity and unlikely probability. Okay. So, this is not that much considered. Why? Because even if that risk happen, it will not have any major impact with respect to the software development, but this is going to have a very greater impact. Okay. So, from the figure here you can understand this 3 is going to have very important criticality, followed by the orange things, blue and the green. So, the priority comes with respect to this stage. So, there is extreme risk, high risk, moderate and low risk. Okay. So, this is going to be the order in which the risk will be taken care for mitigation. Okay. So, when we try to identify and assess, there is a probability, there is a possibility of having biases. So, biases comes into the group majorly through overconfidence and group thinking. So, some experienced person may have much confidence and say that these kind of risk may not occur. Okay. And if you are not going to have multiple groups in identifying the risk, the group thinking will also create or introduce risk at the later point of time. So, this has to be avoided at the earlier stage itself, so that at the later point of time you might not get surprise risks. So, third stage is assessment. So, here we have the same probability impact matrix with which we are going to help identify the prioritized risk and go forward with the contingency measures. And sometimes there is something called as risk appetite statements. So, this is not normal with respect to all the organizations, but some organization has the tendency to set a level of risk that is acceptable, that could be taken care from the organization. So, if they are willing, so based on that this risk appetite will be set and certain risk will be taken in future for contingency. So, here we will look into the characterization table. So, here the risks are being listed, followed by the category, probability, impact and the risk monitoring mitigation strategy that we have to take. Okay. So, here if you consider the risk with respect to customer change in requirements and lack of training on tools, both are having the probability as 80, but the corresponding impact is 2 and 3, right. So, when considering this as a picture, we have to make sure that the impact which is going to have 2 is going to have high priority when compared to the severity marginal. So, next we will look into the quantitative models that are used in identifying the risk and the corresponding impacts. So, one is Monte Carlo simulation, where we will try to use random sampling to model the probability of different outcomes. So, here if you consider in this diagram, we have the likelihood of risk on the y axis and the cost on the right axis. So, from this what we can understand is what is going to be the risk that is associated when the project has a contingency measure. Okay. So, this is going to be the chance of success. So, when your contingency at this point you have a chance of success, but when you drag to the right, there is a risk in the project budget and risk to the business, just because your cost is going to be very high. So, normally when you have risk, we have a set of contingency measure, but the organization have to suffer a set of cost associated, which is going to hinder the entire budget. The second model, quantitative model, through which we can analyze the priority or identifying the decision, is through decision trees. Okay. So, here we have decision tree with which we can identify which risk has to be taken in order to move forward. And dynamic reassessment is also important. So, I have been telling this earlier also. In risk assessment or risk management is not going to be one single phase, it is going to happen throughout the software development life cycle. So, at any point of time we may have to reassess the risk, because at the early time, if you have identified a certain set of risk, they may not be the same during the execution of the project also. So, this risk assessment is very important, risk reassessment is very important, because there is a change in project conditions, environment, business, everything. So, new risk may come into picture, or the already available risk may have turned out to a different mode. So, the fourth stage is mitigation. So, the final stage of risk management, where we have three main options. The first option is avoidance, second is transfer. The avoidance phase is where we are trying to eliminate this risk by changing the project plan and objectives. We are trying to change the plan and make sure the risk gets avoided. Okay. This strategy is undergone when there is too severity and it could be managed effectively. Second is transfer, where we are going to shift the risk to another party through some insurance or contracts. So, this helps in managing the risk and it is beyond the organization control. So, those kind of risk will be mitigated by using the transfer strategy. The contingency plans and reserves are essential for managing the project risk. So, this contingency is going to be the certain set of steps that are predefined and that will be taken once the risk commences. Okay. So, this is used as a buffer when the unexpected events arises in order to ensure the project continuity. So, as an example, we take a predictive maintenance, where our AI driven predictive maintenance helps in anticipating the equipment failures, reducing downtime and improving the operational efficiency. So, here we can use this IoT sensors and the critical infrastructure could be monitored at real time, and by providing early warnings of the potential issues the patient is going to endure, we can have proactive risk management. So, the last one is monitoring and integration. So, monitoring is like it is going to be a overall process that is be a continual process with which we are trying to make sure the risk that has been identified has been taken care at the correct stages. The key risk indicators, which is KRI, is the metric with which we can provide the early warnings of potential risks. So, this potential risk identification is going to help in proactive risk management and decision making. So, risk mitigation strategy. So, we can reiterate this again. So, we have avoidance, transfer and reduction. So, avoidance is trying to aim to eliminate the risk entirely, by removing the non-essential requirements or avoiding certain technologies that pose significant risk. Transfer is shifting the responsibility to another party, which through insurance or outsourcing. So, here the team is not able to manage that risk and we are going to transfer to another party. Reduction is going to be the strategy which is focusing on minimizing the impact and likelihood of the risk, and this is achieved through prototyping, increased testing or additional training. Sometimes these three strategies could not be used, or that could not happen, where we accept certain risk and make sure it is not having that much impact in the development cycle. As a case study with respect to healthcare provider, assume we have a healthcare provider implemented an AI based KRA system to monitor the patient vitals and predict the complications. So, here the complication has to be predicted at real time. So, we can trigger the corresponding patient for some timely intervention. So, by using real time data analytics, we can identify the potential risk and thereby we can trigger the patient for timely intervention. So, for escalation protocols, we have to make sure that the critical risks are addressed promptly and they involve clear authority thresholds and documentation requirements. So, continuous risk management is very important. So, this is an overall process that happens throughout the software development life cycle. So, embedding the risk tasks. So, as I said, we are going to integrate the risk management through every life cycle phase and ensure that risk is continuously identified and addressed throughout the project. And lightweight risk reviews have to be conducted at each and every sprint and milestone to make sure the risks are identified. If any new risk comes into picture, that could be identified and adjust the mitigation strategies if necessary. There could be something called as living risk register, where all the identified risks are documented and tracked. This register is updated regularly to reflect the changes in the risk status. Resource allocation. So, based on the evaluation of the risk landscape, we have to make sure the mitigation effects are focused on the most critical risk at any given time. So, the resources has to be reallocated or allocated in such a way that at each and every instance the important or the most critical risk has to be given much priority and mitigation has to happen for that risk in order to overcome the problem. So, the summary or the key takeaways of risk management is that we have to make sure the risk management is going to happen throughout the entire project life cycle, and it has 4 main phases. It starts from the identification, where proactive risk identification is going to have much good impact rather than reactive identification, followed by the risk assessment, where you quantitatively prioritize which risk has to be given the priority, followed by a planned mitigation, the procedure in which you have to overcome the risk, and finally the continuous monitoring. Okay. So, there would be a certain set of risk which has to be taken for continuous monitoring, and using all these practices we can produce a very good project predictability and the success rate. As an emergent research frontiers, we can go with respect to agile risk management and behavioral risk analytics. So, agile risk management focuses on flexibility and adaptability. So, it ensures that risk management practices evolve with changing project dynamics with respect to the requirements. Behavioral risk analytics examine the psychological factors that influence the risk perception and decision making. So, this enhances the effectiveness of risk management strategies. So, this lecture has discussed the foundations, the risk management, how the risks are being assessed, procedures for mitigation, monitoring, integration and the synthesis. Thank you.